The first thing Eliza heard was her husband's laugh, low, cruel and echoing off the canyon walls as he bartered her life away for 3 painted horses. The desert sky was bleeding into night, crimson and gold fading into shadows, and the wind carried with it the acrid tang of mesquite smoke. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries weaving with the sound of jingling spurs and rough men's voices around the fire. Eliza stood bound near the wagon, her wrists raw where the rope bit into her skin, the coarse fibers grinding into flesh with every twitch of her hands. She wanted to scream, but her throat had gone dry as dust. The words sat trapped inside her, like a bird beating itself against a cage. Her husband, Samuel Price, had never been a gentle man. But until this night, she had not thought him capable of this. He pushed her forward toward the circle of firelight, his grip like iron around her arm. His face glowed orange in the flames, twisted into something both smug and desperate. He had debts, every man in town knew it, and now, in the dimming desert dusk, he was paying them the only way he thought fit. 3 horses, he said, his voice sharp, loud enough to cut through the night. Strong, young, and trained. She's worth that much and more. The men around the fire chuckled, their teeth catching the glow, their eyes glinting with greed and mockery. Eliza felt their stares crawl over her like a swarm of ants, hungry, careless, cruel. She wanted to turn away, but Samuel shoved her forward again, making her stumble in the dirt. Her knees hit hard-packed earth, sending up a puff of dust that stung her eyes. The taste of grit filled her mouth, mingling with the bitter bile rising in her throat. She had known hunger before, cold winters, nights when Samuel spent more in the saloon than he brought home, but this betrayal was different. This was final. This was the selling of her soul. The horses, tethered nearby, tossed their heads and whinnied, their dark eyes rolling white in the firelight, as if they too knew something was wrong, as if they too recoiled from the trade. Their hooves struck the dirt, restless, uneasy. It was then, through the blur of firelight and shadows, that Eliza saw him. He stood apart from the others, near the edge of the camp, crouched low as though he were simply watching. He had the stillness of stone, the quiet patience of a mountain cat waiting in silence. His chest was bare, broad and scarred, catching the red flicker of flames. His long black hair, loose and untamed, fell down his shoulders, and his gaze, those dark, flint-hard eyes met hers. For one moment, time itself stilled. The drunken laughter of men, the snorting of horses, Samuel's bargaining voice, all of it blurred into silence. Eliza could hear only the rush of her own pulse, could feel only the weight of that stranger's stare. There was no cruelty in his eyes, no mockery, no hunger. Only a sharpness, a clarity, as if he saw her chains for what they were, as if he measured the worth of her soul against more than Samuel's greed. Her breath caught. She did not know who he was, this warrior who stood apart, silent and unmoving. But she knew, deep in her bones, that he was different. Samuel grinned, the kind of grin he wore when he thought himself clever. 3 horses for her, and that's a fair trade. You'll not find a prettier woman this side of the territory. The men murmured, some nodding, others spitting into the dust. The fire popped and cracked, sending sparks into the night. Eliza clenched her fists against the rope, the fibers cutting deeper, hot blood welling at her wrists. Anger stirred in her chest, fighting with fear. She wanted to shout at Samuel, to curse him, to tell these men she would not be theirs, not for horses, not for gold, not for anything. But her lips trembled, her voice lost to the roar of flames and laughter. Only her eyes still spoke, and when she dared look again, she found the warrior's gaze had not left her. His face was carved from stone, unreadable, yet his eyes burned with something fierce, something alive. Not pity, not cruelty, but something sharper. Eliza swallowed hard, her pulse hammering so loud she feared the men around her would hear. Somewhere, deep inside her, a spark lit, the faintest flicker of hope thin as the desert wind, but alive all the same. The warrior had not spoken a word. He had not moved, but in that silent stare she knew someone was watching. Someone who might not let this bargain stand. The fire crackled and spat sparks into the desert night, but Eliza could feel nothing of its warmth. She stood trembling in its glow, her wrists throbbing where the ropes dug deeper with every twitch of Samuel's grip. Her husband's hand was a vice on her arm, his fingernails biting into her skin as though she were nothing more than a cow to be led, bartered, and sold. The horses, Samuel said again, louder this time, puffing up his chest as if volume alone might make his demand. Sound reasonable. 3 for her. You'll not find better stock in these parts. The men around the fire exchanged looks, some amused, others wary. One spat tobacco into the dirt, a wet splat lost to the desert dust. Another chuckled low, his teeth broken, his face lined like old leather. To them, it was a game. To Eliza, it was the end of everything. The smell of burning mesquite wrapped around her, thick and acrid, stinging her throat. She coughed, but the sound was swallowed by the drunken laughter that swelled around her. The flames licked higher, shadows stretching long across the sand, and for a moment she thought the night itself was leaning in to witness her humiliation. Her heart hammered. She had always known Samuel to be a hard man, selfish and cruel, but never had she believed he would go this far, to trade her, his own wife, as if she were a sack of grain. Her chest ached with the weight of betrayal, so heavy she thought her ribs might crack beneath it. The horses whinnied again, stamping restless hooves into the dust. Their bodies gleamed in the firelight, sleek, strong, painted with patches of white and brown. Beautiful creatures. Samuel's eyes darted to them, greedy and proud, as though their worth justified his sin. Eliza's stomach twisted at the thought. She had been reduced to livestock in the eyes of the man who vowed once, long ago, to protect her. Then she saw him again, the one who did not laugh. The warrior rose from where he had been crouching at the edge of the circle. He moved with quiet power, each step deliberate, like the slow coil of a rattlesnake before the strike. Firelight washed over his chest, broad and scarred, muscles taut beneath sun-darkened skin. His hair was long, black as raven feathers, flowing loose over his shoulders. Tribal jewelry glinted faintly against his chest, bone and turquoise catching. Sparks of flame. Eliza froze. She had never seen a man like him before. The others had noise in them, mockery, hunger, drunken bravado. But this man carried silence. He did not smirk, did not spit, did not leer. His gaze alone spoke, and it spoke with a force that made her throat tighten. His eyes were like obsidian stones, sharp and unyielding, fixed on her with a steadiness that made her feel both exposed and strangely shielded. She could not look away. The world around her, Samuel's bargaining voice, the men's laughter, the crackle of fire blurred into nothing. There was only the fierce clarity of that gaze. For the first time since Samuel dragged her into this hell, Eliza felt something other than despair. Hope flickered, faint but alive, like a hidden coal beneath ashes. Samuel noticed none of this. He was too busy talking, waving his hand toward her like she were a bundle of goods. She's strong, he boasted. Knows how to cook, clean, keep a house. You men know what that's worth. 3 horses more than fair. Eliza clenched her teeth, rage burning at the corners of her fear. She wanted to scream that she was more than a housemaid, more than a prize to be passed around. But her voice stuck in her chest. The words were still locked away, choked by years of silence under Samuel's rule. The warrior tilted his head, just slightly, and Eliza felt her breath catch. The tiniest nod, as if he'd heard the scream she couldn't. Give. As if he knew, Samuel tugged her closer to the fire, making her stumble again. She bit her lip against the pain, against the tears threatening to spill. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Not in front of them. The warrior's eyes followed every movement. She saw no pity there. Pity was soft, fragile, a look she had seen in the faces of women who whispered behind her back in town. No, this was not pity. This was fire, restrained but burning, as though he saw in her suffering an insult carved too deep to let stand. Her husband laughed again, shoving her forward into the dust. 3 horses, he said one last time, confident, smug. The men muttered, weighing their purses, whispering about the fairness of the trade. But Eliza's gaze was locked on the warrior. He had yet to speak a single word, yet somehow she knew. His silence was louder than Samuel's bargain, and in that silence she felt the first threads of something dangerous defiance. The desert night grew colder as the fire burned low, its flames snapping against the wind that carried whispers of coyote calls across the canyon. The men who had circled her earlier now lounged about in a drunken sprawl, bellies full of whiskey and laughter, their heads nodding heavy with sleep. Eliza sat tethered to the wheel of the supply wagon, her back pressed against the rough wood, her wrists bound so tightly her fingers tingled with numbness. Her husband lay sprawled in the dirt not far from the fire, his snores heavy, irregular, like a rusted saw dragged across timber. Samuel's hat had fallen from his head, and the firelight glowed on his features, twisted even in sleep. She watched him with eyes burning not from tears, but from a hatred that had taken root in her. Chest, dark and unshakable. Once years ago, she had loved him. Now he was nothing but the man who had sold her soul for horses. The air was thick with the stink of whiskey, smoke, and sweat. Eliza turned her face away, breathing shallow to keep from gagging. Her eyes lifted to the sky instead. Above her stretched the endless expanse of stars, cold and infinite, scattered like shards of glass across the black. She had prayed once, in another life, under stars just like these. She had prayed for a child. She had prayed for love. Now, her prayers had turned to nothing but survival. Her fingers twisted against the rope, burning her skin raw. She wanted to fight, wanted to run, but the bonds held fast and fear pressed down like an iron weight. For a long moment, she closed her eyes and let despair swallow her whole dot, then dash movement dot her breath caught. At first, she thought it was the shifting of shadows, the tricks of firelight, but then she saw him, the warrior. He appeared from the darkness like a spirit born of the desert itself, silent as drifting sand. His steps made no sound on the earth. As he crossed into the dim glow of the dying fire, he crouched low, his frame broad and powerful, the scarred lines of his muscles glistening faintly in the starlight. His long black hair spilled forward, brushing his shoulders and around his neck and arms. Bone and turquoise jewelry caught the faintest sparks of firelight. Eliza's pulse surged so violently she thought her ribs might burst. The warrior's eyes met hers. Again. Obsidian, unwavering. They held no mockery, no greed. Instead, they burned with something deeper, a fierce steadiness that pinned her in place and yet freed her at once. He crouched closer, close enough that she could smell him earth, leather, smoke, and something wilder beneath it, like cedar after rain. His voice came low, a whisper, rough as gravel but steady as stone. "You are not theirs." Eliza flinched at the sound. She hadn't expected him to speak, not after all the silence he had carried earlier. The words struck her harder than Samuel's hand ever had. They cut through the night, through her fear, sinking deep. The warrior's gaze flicked toward Samuel's sleeping body, then back to her. His jaw tightened. Not his either. Her chest ached. The tears she had fought so long to hold back welled suddenly, blurring her vision, but she blinked them away. She would not cry in front of him, not this man. Why? She whispered back, her voice hoarse from silence and smoke. He did not answer right away. Instead, he reached to his side, fingers brushing the hilt of the knife that hung at his hip. In one fluid, practiced motion he slid the blade free. The firelight glinted along its edge as he held it steady between them. Eliza's breath came shallow. The warrior's hand moved slow, deliberate, until the blade pressed against the ropes that bound her wrists. The fibers strained. One soft pull, and they would break. One choice, and everything would change. Her husband stirred in his drunken sleep, rolling onto his side with a grunt. Eliza's heart lurched into her throat, and she froze. But the warrior did not so much as glance at Samuel. His eyes never left hers, steady and commanding. "You will not die here," he said, voice firm as bedrock. "Not like this." Not for him. The knife moved. A quick, sure slice. The ropes gave way. For a heartbeat, Eliza only stared at her freed. Wrists red and swollen, her hands trembling as blood returned. She lifted her gaze slowly, meeting his. The warrior's expression did not change, but in the lines of his face she saw the truth of it. He would not let her be bartered, not let her vanish into chains. He had chosen to intervene, and something, inside her something long buried, beaten down by years of cruelty and silence, stirred awake. It was small, fragile, but alive. Hope. The knife's edge whispered against the fibers, and then, with a sharp snap, the ropes fell away. For a moment, Eliza simply stared at her freed wrists, the angry red lines carved into her skin glowing in the dim firelight. She flexed her fingers, shaking as blood rushed back into them. The sudden freedom felt unreal, like a dream so fragile it might shatter if she breathed too loud. Why? The words slipped from her lips before she could stop it, a trembling question carried on a whisper. Her eyes darted to his, searching for the reason behind this dangerous mercy. The warrior's gaze did not waver. His face, carved with strength and silence, was unreadable in the flickering glow. He shifted slightly, the turquoise beads of his necklace catching the light as he turned his head toward the horses tethered nearby. Their eyes rolled white in the shadows, hooves restless in the dirt. He pointed with the tip of his knife. Woman is worth more than beasts," he said, voice low, edged with quiet fury, "and you will not be left here to die in chains." Eliza's chest tightened. No one, not even her own bloodkin, had spoken words like that to her before. They were not gentle words, not soft or comforting, but fierce, as though spoken by fire itself. Her throat burned with a sudden urge to cry, but she bit it back, forcing the tears away. She would not fall apart. Not now. A heavy groan broke through the night. Eliza's heart leapt into her throat. Samuel rolled over in his sleep, mumbling something incoherent, one hand stretching across the dirt as though reaching for her. For a breathless moment she froze, terrified that he would wake. Terrified that the camp would rise and the chance of escape would vanish like smoke. The warrior's hand closed firmly around hers, warm, steady, commanding. "Come," he whispered. He rose in one fluid motion, pulling her with him. Eliza's legs trembled, weak from hours of being bound, and she nearly stumbled into the dust. But his arm slipped around her waist, strong and sure, keeping her upright. He moved like a shadow, each step deliberate, each breath controlled, as though the earth itself bowed to his silence. They slipped past the fire, where one man snored loudly with his hat pulled low over his face. Another twitched in his sleep, muttering curses. The whiskey bottle scattered in the dirt gleamed faintly. Eliza held her breath, every nerve screaming with the fear that one of them would wake. Samuel's voice cracked suddenly in a snore, a harsh sound that tore through the silence. Eliza flinched, pressing herself tighter against the warrior's side. His grip on her waist tightened just enough to steady her. He bent his head close, his lips brushing her ear. "Do not fear," he murmured, voice like stone against water. "We are shadows tonight." The words calmed her in ways she couldn't explain. She nodded once, forcing her legs to keep moving. The horses stirred as they drew near, their ears flicking back, nostrils flaring as if sensing the urgency. The warrior untied one swiftly, his hand sure and quiet even as the leather creaked. Faintly, the stallion shifted, restless, but a soft murmur in his native tongue calmed the beast, settling it enough for him to slip the rope free. Eliza's pulse pounded so loud she was certain it would rouse the entire camp. Each second stretched, thick with tension. Finally, the warrior turned to her, his eyes steady, his voice a quiet command. "Up." She hesitated, glancing back toward the circle of sleeping men. Toward Samuel, the man who had promised her love, once who had stolen years from her life, and who tonight had traded her for horses. The bile of betrayal burned bitter on her tongue. She turned away. With his help, she climbed onto the horse's back, the leather creaking under her weight. Her skirts tangled against the saddle, her hands trembling as she gripped the reins. The warrior mounted behind her in a single, smooth motion, his chest solid and warm against her back, his arms reaching past her to grasp the reins with surety. The horse shifted, stamping the dirt. One of the sleeping men groaned. Eliza held her breath. "Now." The warrior whispered Dot, and with a sharp nudge of his heels, the stallion surged forward. The campfire blurred behind them, fading into streaks of orange against the desert dark. Wind tore through Eliza's hair, carrying the smell of smoke and dust, stinging her eyes until they watered. She clutched the saddle horn, her heart hammering as the warrior guided the horse into the open desert. For the first time in years, she was leaving Samuel behind. For the first time in years, she was no man's possession. The desert air rushed cool against her skin, sharp and alive, carrying her forward into a night filled with danger, freedom, and the unknown. Dot, and in that unknown, sitting before her like a fragile ember, burned the faint light of hope. The desert night exploded into chaos. A drunken shout shattered the fragile quiet, followed by the harsh clatter of boots against dirt. Amelia's breath caught in her throat as a man's hand reached for her trailing skirt, only to meet empty air. The warrior had already hoisted her onto the back of a horse, his movement swift and commanding. The animal snorted and reared, as though sensing the urgency in its master's intent. "Stop them!" her husband bellowed, his voice thick with rage and ale. He stumbled to his feet, fumbling for his pistol. His face twisted into something inhuman under the fire's glow, a grotesque mask of fury and betrayal. The warrior didn't hesitate. With a sharp nudge of his heels, the horse surged forward, tearing away from the camp. Sand and smoke blurred into streaks as they thundered into the desert. Amelia clung tightly, her hands pressed against the warrior's bare chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat amid the wild pounding of hooves. Behind them, curses rose into the night, followed by gunfire. Bullets whistled past, biting into the air with a vicious hum. The horse jolted as dust erupted near its hooves, but the warrior leaned low, guiding it with expert precision. His hair streamed behind him like a banner, black as the star-flecked sky. The tribal jewelry he wore glinted faintly each time the moonlight broke free from drifting clouds. The desert opened before them, an endless stretch of shadows, sagebrush, and jagged rock. Amelia dared to look back. Tiny points of firelight blurred in the distance as the camp fell behind, but the glow moved. Torches! They were coming after them. Her throat tightened. "They'll catch us," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. The warrior glanced back once, then returned his gaze to the horizon. His jaw was set, eyes sharp and unyielding. Though silent, his presence radiated certainty, as though the desert itself bent to his will. For the first time since the nightmare began, Amelia felt the faint flicker of hope. Minutes blurred into a breathless eternity. The horse's flanks heaved with effort, its muscles slick with sweat, but the warrior drove it forward with relentless determination. The sound of pursuit echoed faintly, carried by the dry wind, the pounding of hooves, the bark of angry men, and the distant crack of another gunshot. A sudden flash sparked nearby, the bullet striking stone. Amelia flinched, burying her face against his shoulder. The scent of leather, sweat, and desert sage enveloped her, grounding her in the storm of panic. She felt his hand press firmly against her back, steadying her as though to say, "You are safe." The terrain shifted ahead, rising into a tangle of canyons carved by centuries of wind. Sharp cliffs jutted up like teeth, swallowing the moonlight in their jagged embrace. Without hesitation, the warrior veered toward the dark maze. "Where were we going?" Amelia stammered, clutching tighter as the horse bounded into the narrow passage. Still he didn't speak, but his silence was purposeful, not cruel. Every movement of his body, every decision of his hand on the reins, spoke volumes. He was leading them into cover, into the land he knew better than any map could. Draw. Behind them, voices grew louder, bouncing off canyon walls. Shadows danced in the torchlight that pursued them, distorted and monstrous against the stone. Amelia's pulse raced. The canyon narrowed, the path twisting sharply. At any misstep, horse and riders could tumble into jagged rock. The warrior pulled the horse sharply left, then right, navigating turns that seemed impossible at such speed. His long hair whipped her face, the cool beads of his necklace tapping lightly against her cheek with each jolting stride. She closed her eyes and trusted his strength, her life now tethered entirely to his choices. At last, he slowed the horse, pressing it against the canyon wall. He raised a hand, signaling silence. Amelia's heart thundered so loudly she feared it would give them away. Torches flickered at the canyon's mouth, voices snarling curses into the night. Men shouted, arguing, their words bouncing strangely in the echoing dark. For one tense moment, Amelia thought they would press forward, discover the narrow ledge where the warrior concealed them. But then a gunshot cracked in the distance, followed by the fading thunder of horses heading the wrong way. The sounds grew dimmer. Swallowed by the desert night, Amelia exhaled a shuddering breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her body trembled with exhaustion, with the aftermath of terror. But when she lifted her gaze, she saw the warrior's eyes gleaming in the pale moonlight. Fierce, protective, yet softened with something she couldn't name, for the first time. Since her husband had traded her away like cattle, Amelia felt the ground steady beneath her feet, not because of where she stood, but because of who stood beside her, and though danger still prowled the night, a new certainty settled into her heart. She was no longer running alone. The canyon walls closed in tighter with every thunder of hooves, until it felt as though the stars themselves were being swallowed by the stone. Lila clung to the warrior's back, her arms wrapped around his solid frame, feeling the raw power of each muscle as his horse leapt over rocks and twisted around jagged bends. Her heart pounded in rhythm with the stallion's hooves, and the sharp wind whipped tears from her eyes. Behind them, the voices of drunken men grew louder. Shots cracked against the stone, ricocheting with sparks. "There they are," someone hollered, and the sound carried like an omen through the canyon. The warrior didn't look back. His long black hair streamed in the night air, his jaw set in grim resolve. Yet even as the danger pressed closer, his movements remained controlled, calm, deliberate, as if he had planned this path long before fate had placed her in his care. He slowed suddenly, guiding the horse into a shadowed alcove where the canyon widened and forked. His hand pressed against Lila's shoulder, urging her to stay still. The horse stilled, sides heaving, breath like smoke in the cold air. From here, they could see the glow of torchlight bobbing like fireflies as the pursuers thundered past one fork of the canyon. Lila barely dared to breathe. She could hear her husband's voice rising above the others, slurred but venomous. "Find her. She's worth more than all the damn horses in the territory. That savage won't keep her." The words stabbed at her heart, but the warrior's hand settled lightly over hers, grounding her. His palm was rough, calloused by years of survival, yet the touch was gentle, steady. It said without words, "You are not theirs." Not anymore. When the last echo of hoofbeats faded down the wrong path, the warrior guided his horse out of the shadows. But instead of fleeing deeper into the canyon, he steered them toward a narrow side trail that curved sharply upward. "Where are we going?" she whispered, unable to hold back her fear. He glanced at her, the firelight of distant torches catching. The sharpness of his cheekbones, the determination in his dark eyes. "High ground," he said simply, his voice deep and steady. "Where the fight belongs to me," Lila shivered. Not from cold, but from the realization that he was not running. He was preparing. The trail twisted steeply upward, forcing the horse to climb, rocks clattering beneath its hooves. They emerged onto a plateau that overlooked the canyon like the edge of a great stage. From here, the land stretched into endless shadow, the river below glinting faintly in the moonlight. The air smelled of sage and dust, sharp and wild. The warrior slid off the horse and helped Lila down. He guided her behind a cluster of boulders, his hand briefly brushing her cheek in reassurance. "Stay low. Do not move until I come for you." Her breath caught. "You? You're going to fight them all?" His gaze held hers for a long moment. In the silence, she saw the truth. He knew the odds, but he did not fear them. Strength radiated from him, not only of muscle, but of spirit. The canyon is their grave, if they choose to follow. Before she could protest, he turned away. Drawing from his belt a long knife carved with tribal patterns, its blade gleaming silver in the moonlight. He gathered his hair back, tying it with a leather cord, his silhouette tall and unyielding against the vast dark sky. From below came the sound of hooves once more. The men had realized their mistake and doubled back. Torches flared against the stone walls as they spread out like hunters. The warrior crouched low, scanning the terrain, every sense sharp as a blade. His chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, the turquoise beads of his necklace glowing faintly. He was shirtless against the chill night, but his body was like carved stone, painted by shadows and moonlight. Lila clutched the boulder in front of her, her nails biting into the rock. Her heart raced, torn between terror and awe. She had never seen a man stand like this, unyielding, rooted in something far older and stronger than greed or cruelty. The first rider came into view below, torch high, gun in hand. The warrior melted into the shadows like part of the rock itself, silent, waiting, and Lila understood in that moment. The canyon was no longer a trap. It was a battlefield, and the warrior was no longer a savior by chance. He was the storm that would decide their fate. The night had bled itself dry. As the first strands of gold spilled across the horizon, the canyon slowly gave way to open land-vast plains rolling beneath a sky that promised both danger and freedom. Evelyn clung to the warrior's back as his horse thundered forward, the steady rhythm of hooves carrying them away from the jaws of death. Her heart pounded, not only from fear but from the terrifying realization that she no longer knew what her life meant or where it was leading. Behind them, silence stretched. The men who had pursued them through the night were gone, defeated by the warrior's cunning. his knowledge of the land, and his unbreakable will. But Evelyn knew that safety was not guaranteed. Men like her husband and his ilk never gave up what they considered theirs. They would come again, yet here she was, in the arms of a man who had risked everything to protect her. The warrior slowed his horse near a cluster of cottonwood trees that bordered a creek. The water shimmered in the soft dawn, alive with reflected fire from the rising sun. Evelyn slid from the horse, her legs trembling as though they might give way. He followed her down, his presence looming, steady as stone. For a long moment, they said nothing. The only sounds were the gentle rush of the creek and the cries of waking birds. Evelyn's throat tightened. How did one thank a man for saving a life that had already been sold away? You didn't have to do any of this, she whispered, her voice hoarse. Why? The warrior turned his face toward the sun, the light igniting the sharp planes of his jaw and the strands of his flowing black hair. His chest, strong and scarred, rose and fell slowly, adorned with tribal jewelry that seemed to shimmer with hidden meaning. He looked every bit a figure carved out of legend. You were not theirs to trade, he said at last, his voice deep, resonant. No woman is a possession. Evelyn's eyes stung with tears. She had never heard words like that spoken to her before. In her world, women were bargained, bartered, bound by duty and law. And here stood a man shirtless and wild as the land itself, who spoke of her worth as though it were uncheckable. She dropped her gaze to the ground, then back to him. Then what am I now? His eyes softened, though his posture remained strong. Free, and what you choose next will decide your life. The word free struck her harder than any blow her husband had ever landed. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once, but Evelyn was not naive. Freedom was dangerous, especially for a woman alone in the Old West. She knew that returning to her husband's ranch would mean chains, pain, and humiliation. And yet she could not walk into town alone either, not with the whispers that already followed her name. Her eyes traveled back to the warrior, his body framed by the rising sun. He was a man who lived between worlds, neither fully accepted by the townsfolk nor bound by their rules. He had survived where others would have fallen, and he had chosen, of his own will, to protect her. A slow, trembling breath escaped her lips. Then, may I stay with you? At least until I find my strength? For a heartbeat, silence hung heavy between them. Then, the faintest smile touched his lips. Not soft, not sweet, but something stronger, a warrior's acknowledgment. You ride with me, he said, nodding once. But know this, you must find your own spirit. I will not keep you as they would. Evelyn nodded, a weight lifting from her chest. She wasn't being taken, she was being invited. And that small shift in power meant everything. The warrior lifted her onto the horse once more, his hand steady on her waist. When he climbed up behind her, she felt his strength radiating like the earth itself. They set off across the plains, the sun rising higher, the land stretching wide and wild before them. Evelyn looked ahead, the wind pulling strands of her hair free, her heart swelling with something new. Fear still lingered, yes. But beneath it, hope stirred, fragile yet undeniable. For the first time in her life, she wasn't someone's trade, someone's burden, someone's shadow. She was herself. And she was riding toward a life that had yet to be written. And beside her, the warrior, shirtless, scarred, and unyielding, was no longer just her savior. He was the proof that freedom, though dangerous, was worth every risk. Horizon opened wide, golden, and endless. And together they rode into it.